shifting a little bit onto some of the incredible work you've done around model cards, I know this
Oh,
also stemmed from this effort to make models more transparent. And I'm just curious, how did this particular project come about? And
yeah.
then, where you see it heading in the future.
Yeah. So the model cards project first started at Google. When I first started, I was working on things like fairness and what a rigorous evaluation for fairness would look like. In order to figure out what evaluation to use, you have to have a sense of the context that the technology will be used in, who could potentially use it, both in terms of your intended users and malicious actors, because that really informs the kinds of things that you want to evaluate through ethical and fairness lenses. And so I was working really hard on building up these kind of design documents for how to approach model analyses. And it wasn't getting a lot of pickup. And then around, I forget the year, I want to say it was late 2017, early 2018. I was talking to Tim Neat, who was at that time someone else in the field with similar interests to me. And she was talking about this idea of data sheets, where it's a kind of documentation for data based on her experience at Apple doing engineering stuff, where you tend to have specifications of hardware, but we don't have something similar for data. And she was just talking
Yeah.
about how crazy that is. And so she had this idea of data sheets for data sets. And it really struck me that by having this idea of an artifact, suddenly that's something that people in tech who are motivated for launches would care a lot more about. So
Right.
if we say you have to produce this artifact, and even further, you can launch that and have it count as a launch, then suddenly people are incentivized to do it. So I thought a lot about taking the work I was doing and then packaging it similar to a data sheet to make it more palatable in the tech world. And so then I was trying to think of what is like not a synonym, what's a comparable word to data sheet that could be used for
Yeah.
models. I did want to do something that was shorter, in part because I was keying on this idea of launches that people will use. And so I was like, well, it needs to be shorter. So I guess instead of a sheet, it's like a card,
Yeah.
and then data model. And so her paper she was working on at the time to talk about data sheets was called Data Sheets for Data Sets. And so we ended up calling ours model cards for model reporting. And then once we had the published paper, like everyone started taking it seriously, like both in terms of internally at Google and then externally in the tech world. So yeah, I definitely would not have
Wow.
gotten there if it weren't for Tim Neat's brilliance of, oh, you need an artifact. You need to
Yeah.
make this like a standard thing that people want to produce.
Right.
Um,
That's genius.
yeah.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
fascinating.
We also decided to call it model cards because there were a lot of things at the time that could be used as words in the fairness realm, like fairness reports or like transparency reports or whatever. But the more we talked about it, the more that seemed like something that would soon be dated. I really wanted to
Hmm.
have a generic term that, like, even if fairness and ethics was something people didn't care about anymore, the fundamental
Yeah.
idea would persist. And
Yeah.
so it struck me that, like, saying model card as opposed to some other stuff that came out afterwards, like transparency report, like those didn't catch on as much. And I think in part because they weren't addressing this need to have it be something very generic that would then resonate no matter what you're working on.
Right.
So that was also like a little bit just the name, I think, really helped.
That is brilliant. I've never thought of that longevity of just the name
Right.
itself. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very cool. I'm curious, so where do you see model cards headed in the future?
Yeah, so there's a pretty big barrier to entry for doing model cards in a way that's well informed by ethics, in part because the people who need to fill out these things are often engineers and developers who want to launch their model. They don't want
Right.
to sit around and think about ethics and like write up documentation relevant. And so part of why I wanted to join Hugging Face actually was because it gave me the opportunity to start standardizing how these things could be filled out, finding the patterns, doing sort of gap analysis, strengths and weaknesses, and starting to automate as much as we can. And so one thing I really like about Hugging Face is there's a focus on how to create sort of end-to-end machine learning development processes that are as smooth as possible. And so
Mhm.
I really wanted to do something like that with model cards where you could have something largely automatically generated as a function of different questions that are asked, or even just basics of the model specification directly. So I'm working towards, and I think other people in the field are working towards, the ability to have model cards that are as filled out as possible, and then separately that are also interactive. So this was one of my last, I guess, big projects at Google, was around creating interactive cards where, for example, you can see the difference in the false negative rate as you move the decision threshold. So normally with classification systems, you choose some threshold at which you say yes or no. It's like 0.7. But in practice, you actually want to vary the decision thresholds in order to trade off the different kind of errors. But that means having like a static report of how well it works isn't actually something that is as informative as you want it to be, because actually you want to know how well it works as different decision thresholds are
Right.
chosen. And actually, theoretically, you could use that to decide what decision threshold to be using with your system. And so we created this model card where you could like interactively change the decision threshold and see how all the numbers changed. And moving in that direction of further automation and interactivity, I think is definitely the way to go.
That's brilliant. And I feel like that would be so powerfully used in the future too, just to have better awareness about those thresholds in general.
Right. Yeah. Some
Yeah.
people like don't even know that that's a thing.
Yeah.
When Amazon first started putting out facial recognition and facial analysis technology, it was found that like the gender classification disproportionately was bad for Black women. And Amazon sort of responded to that by saying, like, oh, this was done using the wrong decision threshold. And then one of the police agencies who had been using one of these systems were asked what decision threshold they were using. And they said, oh, we're not using a decision threshold. Which is like, oh, you
Oh,
really don't understand how this works. And you're using this out of the
yeah.
box with default parameter settings. That's a problem. So like
Yeah.
minimally having this documentation brings people to be aware that you have some decisions to make with respect to the
Yeah.
various hyperparameters.
Yeah, that is wild. It continues to blow my mind how often things are released that haven't been run by these basic kind of checks and balances.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Blows my mind. I remember when the
Yeah.
pandemic started, I wanted to record a podcast with my friend who's a Black woman, and Google had just released the Google Meet record. And so I talked her into, I was like, we'll just use that, it'll be super easy. And the entire recording is just of me because it didn't recognize when she was speaking.
Yeah.
I was so upset. I couldn't
Yeah.
believe that was
Yeah.
even
You're like, why
possible.
didn't you test that? And it's the
How?
culture, right? It's just not, it's the people who develop models often don't care about all those other things. And so they're just getting out models, and they're
Right,
not tested and they're not explained in terms of
right.
how they work, in part because no one knows, because it hasn't been tested. And that's so different than everything else we put out,
Yeah.
like toys and medicine and cars, right? There's all
Yes.
these like strategies of how you really test this to see if this works. And that just isn't there in machine learning, in part
Yes.
because it's new. So like the laws and regulations don't exist yet. It's sort of like the Wild West or whatever. But yeah, that's part of what we're trying to change by doing things like model
Yeah.
cards and data sheets and stuff.